Our last talk of the day, which is by Harman again, Hudson Bay, the 1970 and the 1970 centenary, and the revival of keelboats and the introduction of optimists. Harman.
Presentation?
Yep. Well, this is just a general picture of the club in the 1920s and 30s, and we've already seen it, but the clubhouse is here, the starter's hut is here. We've had the dates for those before, sure. And the jetty was originally a sunken barge, and then seemed to be some sort of a temporary structure. And finally, we got a jetty out of the ESB in the 1930s, claiming that the Shannon works had destroyed our jetty situation. It just gives you the scene anyway. And Vincent mentioned that about the racing for the Tailteann Games, but in fact, from at least 1910, the annual regatta had included motorboat racing for members of the Motor Yacht Club of Ireland. And that's the ensign, more or less, of the Motor Yacht Club of Ireland. There's a well-known ship, the Seagull, that sometimes sails these waters, and she flies the ensign of the Motor Yacht Club of Ireland. And there she is, flying the ensign of the Motor Yacht Club of Ireland. The starter's hut, I think, was particularly associated with these activities. In fact, probably built in preparation for the Tailteann Games, which were a sort of Irish Olympics. And in 1928 was the second Tailteann Games, and this may be a scene from that, but certainly you can see the hydroplanes here in the foreground, and other motorboats as well, and quite a crowd gathered round taking a great interest in it. So that's a facet of the yacht club that has, one might say, mercifully died away, but it's an interesting part of our past. And the regattas, there was no mooring facilities ashore, and so if you came to the regatta in your motor yacht, or indeed in a big sailing yacht, you had to moor offshore. So you can see this is a typical regatta scene, and this lasted really up until the building of the stone sort of pier at the south end of the old club, and then of course the floating jetty in much more recent times. And I can remember attending many's a regatta and having to swing on swing moorings here, and then rowing ashore to get your boat ready for racing and so on. So that scene, which has died away completely now, was the common scene at regattas certainly in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and even 70s. And the big yachts began to die out in the 1920s, and by the secretary in his report said that by 1928 only 2 yachts were left, Truant and Foam, that were still in the club, and there were 6 Shannons sailing then. So it was a very small beer indeed. And this shows some of the Shannons sailing in the 1930s, or perhaps a little later, 40s maybe, I'm not sure. But note they have no kicking straps, and they're starting off the wind here, and the booms are lifting up in a rather hairy fashion. And this is the last of the big yachts to be seen in these waters. Truant still survives. This is Elphin, and I can just remember Elphin being moored just south of the railway bridge in Athlone. And she'd originally belonged to the Gleasons, and then she'd been bought by my grandfather prior to the Truant. And then she was sold on, and at some stage Sid Shine and a chap named Dermot Lane bought her in Athlone, and that's when she was moored just below the railway bridge, up to the 1950s at some stage. And last seen on Ballykieran Lough, where Dermot Lane had a railway wagon on the shore. And I remember being there about maybe the 1960s, and we went ashore there, and the shell of the elfin was just pulled up on the shore beside the railway wagon. There's been a lot of development around there. I went there a few years ago to see if I could get a bit of her, but she seemed to be entirely gone as far as I could see. So that she was the last of the yachts, and she, when she was she wasn't obviously racing by 1937, and in 1937 the Truant and the Foam, the last two yachts, were sold off. I have to say my grandfather sold the Truant, but he didn't tell my father that he was selling her until she was sold. I don't think it was very popular, but then grandfather was paying bills. They were probably getting a bit annoying. So the club sailed during the war, and Squeaky Smith, who's over there on the extreme left, you can just see about half of him, he was retired, well, he'd been in the First World War. I think he'd come in, from the reserve, and he was injured in the war, and that's why he had a squeaky voice. Some people said he'd been hit in the throat, but less charitable people suggested it was somewhere else. But to give him his due, he ran the club. He was difficult enough character, I think. But to give him his due, he ran the club through the war, and we had sailing during the war here, Second World War, and he ran it up to about the 1950s or so. He was known as Pooh-Bah towards the end. That's to say, he was Lord High Everything. He was Lord High Everything else. He was Commodore, Vice Commodore, Rear Commodore, Secretary and Treasurer, Starter, and his wife made the teas. An interlude at that time, sort of last hurrah in some ways, was a visit by the Madras Yacht Club. And these were people who were running, the English British colony in India, and they had formed the yacht club in Madras. And India, as they say, packed up about 1948, and so, but they must have come back to England and kept together as a group. And so they came here in 1948, 1950, 1951, and 1953. And it was a considerable social occasion. They sailed a team race against Lough Ree, and they also gave a cocktail party on the shore, and lots of the great and the good from Athlone came out to the cocktail party. So this is a picture of the group that was there, the sailors and some of the cocktail party people. And I was rather amused looking at all the people here in this row sitting down, all of that group there. Only two of them are actually sailors, Dolly Lister and her sister Mary Lister. The rest are what are commonly called hangers-on. I don't want to be unkind because some of them are relations in the room. But in the back row are the sailors then, and there's an interesting little group of people up here. It consists of a guy from Madras, the Commodore's mother, Lola, Frank Cohen, and Joe Lister, the late Joe Lister. And they're young, say about 10 or 12 years of age or something, over there. So it's an interesting little interlude. I don't know if it has anything to do with it, but about that time, it was when Sean McBride became a member of the government, and there was a sort of rising tide of republicanism in the country. And we in the Yacht Club had adopted the coat of arms of Athlone as our burgee in 1895, and that progressed to an ensign. And so we had the two roses and a lion on the ensign, but we had the Union Jack, of course, in the corner of the ensign. And after 1922, we didn't fly any ensign at all, because it wouldn't be that prudent to be flying the Union Jack in Cousin. And so things rested so until about 1950. And then there was a sort of rising tide of republicanism. And so the next thing was there was an incident. And we were told that the tricolour was at last going to be hoisted in Lough Ree Yacht Club. So it was all done by agreement. And on the clubhouse roof, Tommy Gallagher, who was a member of the club and a sailor, he erected, and very handy, he erected a flagpole, and Paddy Lenihan, who was a member of the club and happened to be chairman of the county council as a boat owner, he came and he hoisted the tricolour. And the Coulson, quote, IRA, unquote, paraded on the front lawn and formed a guard of honour. And I did once see a photograph taken from the steps showing the guard of honour, of course from the rear, you see, they didn't know it was being taken, and you can clearly see Paddy Lenihan up on the roof, that would be Mary O'Rourke's father, up on the roof hoisting the tricolour. And there was a similar sort of incident in Lough Ree, where Neddy Hogan hoisted the tricolour on the big pole that was then at the end of Goose Island. And so after that, they decided, well, we better do something about this. So the two clubs wrote to the Department of Industry and Commerce and asked, would it be all right if we flew a defaced tricolour, in the corner of the ensign? And the Department of Industry and Commerce said that it would. So with their permission, we have our present ensign. And I say these things because flags mean a lot to people, and you'll be surprised, how many people fly the ensign and the burgee. I would say in many cases people who aren't members of the club or who haven't paid their subscription or something fly it on boats, cruisers around the lake. So it's a bit of a story to it. I would dearly like to get a copy of that little photograph, but I don't have it. So then other exciting events were Dinghy Week. The Irish Dinghy Racing Association was founded after the Second World War with Douglas Hurd as the president or chairman or runner, person in charge of it anyway. And it was very successful and boats like Fireflies were sailed, and the water wags, of course, were already existing dinghies, and so were we. And the association commissioned a new boat, a 14-foot dinghy. And so they used to run a dinghy week at various venues. And this club was the venue for dinghy weeks in 1948 and 1952. And there were about 36 boats at the 1948 dinghy week and about 70 at the 1952 dinghy week, which attracted the luminary Uffa Fox, who was a great British sailing guru and who sailed with Prince Philip in his dragon at Cowes subsequently. So this is a scene on the jetty here of the club, and you can see the Fireflies rigging, probably it's the second dinghy week. And this is an advertisement for it, you see, but whether it's the first or the second, I don't know, because it says the date's all right, but it doesn't say what year, but I suppose it didn't matter at the time, because everyone knew it was this year. And so that was another interlude. But the dinghy weeks revealed that the facilities at the club weren't great. For example, the gentleman's loo consisted of a trench, as you sort of what you'd get in the army in the 19th century, and you did your business at this trench. There was a slightly better facility, one for ladies, but and the clubhouse was pretty primitive, and the club didn't have the resources or the money to do anything very fancy. And and of course it was on a lee shore, as we all know. And then another possibility opened up. And this was when Paddy Lenihan here, P.J. Lenihan, the man who was a member of the club, hoisted the flag as chairman of the county council, later TD, father of Mary O'Rourke and Brian Lenihan, a marvellous character, started a hotel on the far side of the lake. And it became clear that we would be very welcome over there, and there was a jetty, and it seemed that we could use the shed at the back for the sails, and we could use the hotel virtually as a clubhouse for the regatta. So the club were offered a site over there as well, and where the chalets are, you know, the little wooden chalets are. And so there was a vote in 1954 to move the club. But not everybody was in agreement, and so there was a bit of a split on the issue. Finally, in 1958, the water was very high and the jetty was unusable. And so finally the regatta did move over to Hudson Bay that year, which was the first year that I actually sailed actively at a regatta with we had the honour of sailing with Lionel Lister and Tom Feely, and it was a great and wonderful experience and wonderful education that I went with, but it was really wonderful. They were great guys to sail with. And the driving force in the club then was this gentleman over on the left, who most of you will remember, Sid Shine. Many of you perhaps remember as a fairly elderly sort of father figure coming out in recent years before he's dead. But in fact, the Lough Ree Yacht Club was close to dying, and Sid certainly kept it alive. He brought in young people, he dispensed hospitality, and he operated the regatta from the Fox, which moored at the jetty at the Hudson Bay, and he brought in Colonel Hooker from Lough as the starter, and a great character he was. And this is the scene in 1958. This is the whole regatta in 1958. There were 6 Shannon 1 designs and 3 or 4 IDRA 14s from Clontarf. And these are some of the IDRA 14 chaps that you won't recognise there. And looking across here, you can see Tom Feely, Lionel Lister, Costello, Reggie Goodbody is in the room, Peter Dobbs, Jody Gallagher, Louis Courtney, Teddy Knight, the Glennons, Sid Shine, Frank McGann, my mother, Doreen Darcy, Alf Delaney, Colonel Hooker, Susan McGann, Bunny and Betty Goodbody, Tommy Gallagher, Zena Sherlock, Desmond Simmons, Edwin Hunter, Jimmy Reed, Harman Murtagh, Peter Delaney, Kenneth Simmons, whose ashes I helped to spread on Lough last year, June Simmons, and Arthur McGann, the crewman of the St. Brendan. So it's a small regatta, but very successful regattas they were, and you could walk in and out of the hotel. Paddy Lenihan dispensed hospitality in the bar, and we had a great little dinner there at the end, and prize giving. So they ran very, very well indeed, the regattas over there. But the Hudson, and it was during that time that the Optimus started. And what happened was Dr. Alf Delaney, who always attended the regattas, extraordinarily loyal to the club, he said he'd seen junior sailing in Dublin, and he recommended that we should get involved in it. And so, what was the year? Did I have it here? Yeah, 1968. He came down, and he, at our invitation, and with an Optimist, and he made a presentation in the Crescent Ballroom, and we invited anyone we could think of that might have purchased one for children. And so there was a good crowd in the Crescent, and Alf gave a very good speech about it, and it all went very well until the end, when we said, well, now, would there be anyone interested in buying an Optimist? And there was silence. And this was very disappointing. So anyway, that was that, and we went off, and then Edwin and I went round and called on the various people, and we discovered that 12 of them were indeed delighted to buy Optimus. But I said, you said nothing at the launch. They said, that's because the Inspector of Taxes was sitting in the front row. And we didn't want him to think we had any money. Well, in fact, the Inspector of Taxes turned out to be one of the purchasers. And people like Graham Kieran and John Keane and my brother-in-law Michael McNamara all came into the class at that time. Dan Hanovic. Anyway, we got 12 Optimists going for the first year, and they first sailed at Hudson Bay, and the class has waxed and waned ever since, but it's extremely strong at the moment, and we've become much more professional about it. But we got off to a great start, and we got 12 the first year, built by Rodney Lomax in Mullaghmore, and then we got, I think, 7 or 8 the second year, built by Lawrence Archer in Kilrush. Rodney Lomax's boats were much longer lasting. They didn't look as well, they weren't quite as well finished as the Archer boats, but they lasted much better. and of course the class is alive, extraordinarily healthy in the club today. It has had its ups and downs. But I remember in particular when the late Jimmy Reid was operating it, it was definitely, he pulled it from being in the doldrums a bit into very successful class. They're a wonderful, wonderful little boat, and so many people have come through into sailing that way. Then in 1970, we were getting a bit crowded out in the Hudson Bay. And Paddy Lenihan had sold the hotel at this stage. I can't remember whether he was dead or not, but he was no longer there to entertain us anyway. The atmosphere had got a bit chilly, and also there were more and more cruisers and interference at the public jetty there. You know, it wasn't just as pleasant as it had been. And so we met and we wondered what we'd do, and we decided that we're coming up to the bicentenary of the club, that we'd have to move back to Ballyglass. So that's what we did, and we came back to Ballyglass. I remember working on the rotten roof of the clubhouse then with Dan and others. And anyway, we started getting the club going back here. And we had, we used the bicentenary, you know, to make a big thing of it, as not just for itself, because we saw it as a very good sales opportunity for sailing, and so it proved. And we've some photographs of it out there that were taken by the late Roy Redpath, and they're good photographs, and most of the photographs from the period were taken by Jack Simmons, who was just a great photographer, I mean, really great photographer. Roy Redpath, very good as well. And this is Teddy Knight staging a capsize for Roy Redpath, but you notice it's in flat calm waters. So it's a phony picture if ever there was one. And this is the program, you see, with the Burgee and bicentenary regatta. And we made a big deal out of it, and it was a very successful event. Now, last of all, the last thing I want to touch on is we saw the cruisers dying out in the 1930s. And with the development of the Shannon Boat Rally in the 1960s, they introduced fiberglass cruisers were now appearing on the scene. And they were much more economically manageable than the wooden boats which had died out. Had been. And so they started cruiser sailing on the boat rallies. And from that, it extended to them having races on Lough Ree. And I think at that stage, Peter Mulvihill was the Commodore. I'm just trying to remember, but my memory might be a bit hazy on this now. Peter Mulvihill was Commodore. But anyway, we had a discussion on the committee to decide what we should do about it. And, you know, should we take the Lough Derg line and say, well, we don't want cruiser racing in the club? Or should we say, well, our tradition was that we did have cruiser racing, and if there's cruisers racing in Lough Ree, we should race under the Burgee of Lough Ree Yacht Club. So that was what we agreed. And we approached, I'm nearly sure it was Damien Delaney, that's why I put his boat here in the foreground. I think it was Damien we approached, and we said, why don't you come and sail under the Burgee of Lough Ree Yacht Club? And tell you what, we'll give you a free membership for the season. And if it works out, that's great. And if it doesn't work out, sure, we'll all be friends. So they came, they accepted that, and they came to the club, and we provided racing for them, and they were happy to stay on at the end of the year. And before you could say Jack Robinson, some of them were officers of the club and became Commodore, and of course totally integrated into the club now. So that was a rather different line that we took, and I think it was the right line that we took, that we took a different line to Lough Derg. They wouldn't take in the cruisers, and now they're lumbered with those yokes. sorry, Reggie. No. I think that's all. Yes.